Sometimes you get to a point in your life where you're on a timeline and it starts spitting you out. That timeline says you're not welcome here anymore. Or it can be that you're jumping out of a lower timeline. So whether a timeline is spitting you out or you're jumping out of a timeline, today's conversation is going to help you understand more about timelines and more about why it is that some things just aren't working out for you, no matter how hard you're working and trying to be in a certain place or to be liked by certain people or to just get something right. It's not working out. This can be because you're on a timeline that you don't belong on, and the matrix is trying to spit you out because your frequency is upsetting the apple cart. You see, when you start raising frequency, this is when a lower timeline is going to say, not so much, thank you. You're not so welcome here. Your presence is not enjoyed here. And you're going to start to feel that. You're going to start to feel kind of like, do I smell? Why don't people want to be around me? Why do people keep misunderstanding me? Why do people gang up against me? Why is it that no matter how good my intentions are, people misread them? This is often because of the nature of a timeline. So let's talk about that. We're going to talk a lot today about timelines, the nature of timelines, how you are meant to work in them, and where you're being asked to go, and how. How do you actually consciously move through various timelines? So let's start with understanding what a timeline is. First of all, here I am telling you all about different timelines when in truth there's only one overall total timeline. There's one overall timeline, but it contains so many different, in fact, every different frequency within it that it feels like madness, it feels like pandemonium, and it's doing that for a very important reason, because we're getting ready to move through the ascension point. This is called the event. Many videos on my channel talk about it, and as we come closer, we're getting through the eye of the needle, as we come closer towards the ascension point, these different frequencies start gathering, as they are right now, into two dominant energies. The one energy, so you can think about it as a current or a stream of energy within the timeline. The one stream is headed for 5D, and the other stream is headed for 4D. So both are elevations, by the way. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, because a lot of people get lost on the fact that, ultimately, the timeline will split into two, and a lot of people get lost on the split and they go, but what about my loved ones? And by the way, we'll talk about that. What about my loved ones if they land up on another timeline? But very few people seem to celebrate the fact that neither timeline remains in 3D. Very few people seem to entertain the fact that what this means is that we're very much done with lower levels of 3D, with the false matrix, with being conned, with being manipulated, with being enslaved. Because either way, you're stepping into a fourth dimensional or a fifth dimensional outcome. These two streams are purifying into the highest versions of themselves. However, the lower timeline, and when I say the lower timeline, I'm saying the lower frequency. It's not the bad people. It's not the worst place to be. It's simply a lower frequency. So I'm not saying there's a higher timeline because only the good people go there, and there's a lower timeline because that's where all the Nimrods hang out. What I'm saying is this is quite simply two diverse frequencies. And the 5D frequency remains on this planet. We move through the ascension window called the event, the great solar flash. We move through that, and that is the final break apart of these two streams within one timeline into two separate timelines. But for the sake of today's conversation, I'm referring to these two streams of energy as two timelines, even though technically it's all encapsulated in one space. So technically it's still one timeline. But here's why, for the first time perhaps, I'm referring to two timelines within one. There's a very important reason, because these two streams are separating, and the frequency difference between the two is very substantial. And what's taking place within these two streams right now is, instead of what they used to do, which was this, they would meander, they would kind of interweave with each other, interlock at times, even you yourself would have flowed from one to the other, back and forth. You would have woven in and out of the two streams and not even known it really. But now you know it, because the two streams are so diverse. So what's going to happen is, you're going to go into one and life's going to work. And you're going to go into the other and life will not. But particularly, what you're going to find is the people who police the timeline. I'll explain to you who they are. The people who police the timeline, they're going to eject you, reject you from their space. So who are the people that police the timeline? Well, the timeline police, so to speak, are everyday, average, ordinary human beings without the job title of timeline police. They are the people who do not want those who challenge them to be in their space. They are unknowingly, unwittingly, policing a frequency, because ultimately what all of these frequencies are belief systems and the bandwidths associated with them. So there are people, for example, that are very fervent in a belief. Maybe they're Trump supporters, maybe they're Trump haters. It doesn't matter. I use the example of Trump because why not, right? If we're going to talk about people on the planet with two very distinct points of view, let's talk about that. Let's talk about vegans and let's talk about carnivores. There you go. There's two people with very distinct points of view. Let's talk about people who are about Bitcoin and people who say it's a heap of rubbish. These are people with very different viewpoints. But what you're going to find more and more is that people who have their viewpoint only want to hang out with people who have their viewpoint. And the moment you're seen to not be in vibrational synergy with their viewpoint, you get outcast. So those are the police, so to speak, of the timeline. They take their job very seriously and they want to convert and convince you to be something else. And so what these people do is they continually tell you who to be, how to be, what to think, when to think. Very often it comes in the form of unsolicited advice. Very often it comes from people who you know and you trust, and in their core, they may be perfectly innocent and perfectly good. That's why I said to you moments back, when I talk about the lower timeline and the higher timeline, I'm not talking about good people and bad people. I'm just talking about people who've aligned to two different frequencies. But because those two different frequencies now are distinct, they weren't before. That's why you could weave in and out of them. They weren't so distinct. They're now very distinct. Where you're going to find a group of people gathering who gather first into themselves. This is an important part of the timeline separation, because as you get spat out of, rejected from the lower timeline, what's going to happen is you're going to come up against a fear, and the fear is the fear of loneliness. And it's a very obvious fear. Most people will go through it, or they've been through it already. And it's somewhere connected to rejection and abandonment and outcast and not belonging, all of those very uncomfortable feelings, or feelings that you have to traverse through, because, we lived in a false matrix, right? And the false matrix was a prison, and the prison was the mind. But guess who upheld the false matrix that you personally lived in? The greatest policeman of the false matrix that you lived in was you, because that was how the false matrix was designed. It was designed to self-contain. So as much as I'm talking to you about the police of various timelines, we were all once those police to ourselves, wherein we wouldn't let ourselves be challenged. We wouldn't let ourselves be challenged beyond a certain comfort zone, because the change would have been too big. And then you would have stepped out of the known discomfort into what? An unknown discomfort or an unknown comfort. The risk was too great. Either way, you were going to step into the unknown, and the wiring of the false matrix said, go anywhere, but hell, just don't go into the unknown. So we very obediently kept ourselves in the known. Sometimes we stretched the bars and the barricades and really entered into some new territory, but it was still within proximity to the known. We didn't venture too far from that at all. But now, as we get ejected from the false matrix, what a lot of people are going to do is say, I want to get back in there. I want to get back. I want belonging with my friends and family. So you've got a lot of people right now defending the false matrix and defending their place in the false matrix. And very often, that big hurdle is, but I don't want to be outcast, but I don't want to be alone, but I'm scared of the unknown. Those hurdles, they get faced. And then you can almost intuitively connect with the place between these two timelines, so to speak. You can almost intuitively connect, but there's a void in between the two because there's gathering space between the two because they're so distinct now. So a lot of people gather an intuitive sense of a limbo-like space or a fear. And this is a fear of that limbo-like space. And this is because they're intuiting the difficulty of having a foot in each world, because eventually it's like you're doing the splits. Eventually those two streams of consciousness just become so separate, so apart from each other that you can't maintain balance anymore. You're going to fall eventually. And a lot of people don't want to fall into the space between the two timelines, which feels very much like an empty void like space. It's actually not an empty void like space. It is in fact 4D, but that's another story. In fact, if you want to learn more about 4D, just type in Kerry K 4D. There's a couple of videos where I have spoken about it. When you find yourself being ejected from a timeline, don't be afraid to go through the feeling of rejection you may feel. Don't be afraid to go through the feeling of loneliness that you might feel. Don't be afraid to go through and to confront the feeling of change, the feeling of upheaval, because as you're spat out of an old timeline, what's happening is a once comfortable place is no longer home to you. It's no longer welcoming you. And you must remember that was once a comfortable place. What it's going to teach us all is more unconditionality. Do you know why? Because a lot of you are going to have people on the old timeline or the lower timeline. You're going to have people there who you love. And you're going to witness them there, and you're going to want to save them and realize that you can't. You're going to want to wake them up and realize that it's not your job. You can only be the awakening. And in fact, the best thing you can do is step into the higher timeline, because that way you send off a frequency, you send off a signal that becomes an invitation. That's the best form of waking others up that we have, is stepping into our higher alignment, not staying in the lower timeline and trying to wake them up there, but actually stepping into the higher timeline. So it's going to teach us unconditionality, because you're going to learn to just let them be where they are and love them deeper anyway. You're also going to learn that life is easier when you're not so close to them, because you're continually in these two very different frequencies, and it doesn't feel harmonious because it's not anymore, and it's going to become less and less harmonious. And they're going to find their life works better without you in it. They're going to find, those in the lower timeline, that they just feel more comfortable without you, because whether you say a word or you don't, your presence challenges them. And what we're noticing with these two streams is that the two streams are becoming encapsulated. Encapsulated, meaning the frequencies that they're each containing are so distinct from each other. The difference between these two frequencies is in a way congealing, because frequency will actually do that. It's one of the reasons why our chakras had in the past a sheath containing each chakra. That used to happen. It's over the time, and I'd say perhaps the last 10 years, and it will still continue to happen, where that sheath around each chakric point eventually dissolves until your chakras become one column. So it's very natural that when energy is very distinct and separate from another, it's very natural that it will encapsulate itself. It tends to do that. These two timelines, or these two streams within our timeline, is doing exactly that. They are developing a very penetrable wall, you could say, or a sheath. It's very penetrable still. It's just going to become thicker and thicker and harder to be in the two worlds, to interact in the two worlds. Eventually, you're going to feel like you're not seen by a lot of people, which you won't be when you're in a higher timeline. That's going to get worse. For those of you that say, I feel like people don't see me, I feel like I'm in the car and they just don't register that I'm there, or I stand right next to them and it's kind of like they ignore my presence. A lot of people in the lower timeline will do that to people in the higher timeline, and they're not even being rude. They really are not registering your presence. So it's going to become perhaps a little bit weird for a while until eventually those two streams completely move apart from each other. And that final point we know is the point that we call ascension. For some people, it has to be a radical spitting out. In other words, that timeline's got to radically spit you out, and it's got to be nasty about it, because there's something in you that might just want to stay because it's comfortable, or because you've got friends there, or whatever the case might be. But what's going to happen is eventually you'll have to surrender to being alone, to building the new frequency. This is part of the process of stepping into the higher timeline. You step into your fear first of aloneness, then the joy of aloneness, the wonder of aloneness, and then eventually that blossoms into self-acceptance and a deeper sense of wholeness, and you start going, heck, this unknown place is actually quite beautiful, and life starts flowing and working for you. The people who consciously want, by the way, to shift timelines in this way. So I've spoken about the option of the timeline spitting you out, but remember, there's also people who consciously want to jump timelines too. Those people need to employ the method that I'm talking about here. And by the way, I teach this all at a very, very deep and profound level in my online community. Go watch call 143. That was last week's call, if you're a member of the Plasma Light Tribe, or if you want to join. Call 143 was the start of a very deep level of work where we're working at how to let higher consciousness in. And that's part of shifting those timelines, because it's through you engaging with your higher self that you can be in the higher timeline, because that's where the higher self resides. But I know there's going to be people that say, what happens to those on that 4D timeline? They perish at the event. So at the event, they will perish. They're not going to move into 5D. The people who move into 5D are the people that remain here on the planet. They move into 5D. There's a video that I've done. I know I always refer to previous videos just because there is so much content, guys. There's so much work that I've released that you guys ask me about in the comments, but I've already covered it. So if you go and you watch the Ascension Wave practice round, that's going to give you a lot of insight into what actually takes place at Ascension. There's also It Goes Dark Before Ascension. There's a number of videos that you can watch to catch up on this if you need to. But for those people who are not staying on planet Earth because they're not moving into the higher timeline, they'll perish at the Ascension event, and they'll reincarnate then into a new body, new name. They won't have memory of where they've been, just like you don't have memory of where you were in the lifetime before this, but they'll start a brand new ascension cycle. We'll also start a brand new cycle, but we'll start a brand new cycle in 5D. And I'm going to leave a video for you over here. This is another perler of a video. I released it some time ago, and I have a feeling that quite a few of you would have missed this one, so go ahead and watch this about the Ascension Wave. Lots of love from my heart, all the way to yours.